All right, everyone, let's get this party started. So, I'm just going to launch right into the material right now, save class announcements for emails and that sort of thing. I do want to address, the material we're getting into. It has the coolest title of anything I think we're reading. But it is kind of different, and if you're not familiar with it, it's may need an introduction. So I'll be primarily talking about the one reading that I posted for this week, The Dark Enlightenment and the Anthropocene, readings from the Book of Third Nature as Political Theology by Timothy Luke. Probably, like I said, the coolest title of anything that we're reading this semester. So, political theology, what is that and why are we reading it? Theology is, the study of religion, the study of spirituality, that sort of thing. Political theology, as we'll discuss, is a term used to basically describe the ways in which politics and political institutions have kind of taken the place, and in some ways taken even the language of past religious organizations. And that, you can kind of trace the social evolution of institutions, political institutions, and so on, from their past in ancient religions and different theologies and so on. So anyway, it's not necessarily straightforward, and we're going to kind of be looking at it in a sort of a meandering way by looking also at this group called neo-reactionaries, who are kind of these writers, sometimes associated with the political alt-right, who are influential and in some ways have adopted some of the language of political theology and some of the direction, whether they know it or not, and I'll explain that, my views on that shortly. So the readings that you're going to be doing is coming from Timothy Luke. There's also the Giada Scoto one, which I'm not sure if I post that for next week. That may be an optional reading or something. There's another issue they had called Political Theory, Political Theology. These are, I think, interesting articles and journals that focus on, at least these issues, focusing on these ideas of political theology. So, anyway. Now, however, when we talk about political theology today, we'll talk about religion and some of those things, but then we're also talking about this new sort of political theology of neo-reaction. And what does that mean, and what are we talking about here? Well, today, primarily we're looking at power being concentrated and accumulating within people in who work within the tech industry and occupy those commanding heights of the economy and so on. Bertrand Russell, the famous social philosopher, said the fundamental concept in social science is power, in the same sense that energy is the fundamental concept in physics. The laws of social dynamics are laws which can only be stated in terms of power. So this is where politics becomes interesting, because anything that then looks at power, you can really apply to human relations and political relations. Some would say even like readings of the occult and magic and stuff like that. You can even look at those sort of principles and their sort of epistemologies and so on, and look and see how they've evolved into modern politics. But also always keeping in mind that we are just primates in between the bonobo and the chimpanzee, and this will come come into focus even more when we talk about political attitudes later on. But so that we do have different power structures, hierarchies, and so on. And some of these behaviors aren't easily captured by our philosophies, as we shall get to. Basically, when I say our philosophies, our political philosophies, I'm talking about the political philosophies that came out of Europe during the Enlightenment, basically the probably 1600s through the 1800s, maybe 1500s forward, where you had a lot of aristocrats who had money, they had time, a lot of them had investments overseas and the colonies that were developing and so on, and so they were exposed to new things, new people, new ideas, new parts of the world, that sort of thing, and they would get together and discuss these things. And they sort of developed, and then I should say, back up a little bit. And, there was a lot of different ways in which the Enlightenment happened. Some of it was, say, advancing notions of Christianity, but in different ways. Some of it was rejecting religion in favor of a less theistic approach. And it was really marked by the gradual adoption of the scientific method to understand how things worked, and then, from there to construct things. And it's out of that you have the first sociologist, Auguste Comte, comes along and says positivism is a theory of knowledge according to which the only kind of sound knowledge available to the human kind is that of science grounded in observation. So again, talking about empirical research, gathering data, analyzing it, and so on. So you have the scientific revolution. People are thinking about the universe and, natural processes in new ways. They're starting to think about human development and human social structure in new ways. You also have kind of happening at the same time and sort of early on the end of a lot of major conflicts. We kind of talked about this a little bit, but just to go over, again, you have the Treaty of Westphalia. This was important. It was the end of what was called the 30 Years' War, and this was a war that went on for actually a little bit longer than 3 decades, and was a conflict between many of the different powers we've discussed so far, like the Habsburgs, Spain, the Swedes, the Scandinavians, parts of the Germans and Prussians, and so on. Mostly fought in what today is Germany and parts of Eastern Europe, and it was very bloody, very gruesome, and the treaty that was signed at the Peace of Westphalia, it more or less developed the modern nation-state system as we know it today, that we think of as countries, not necessarily the exact countries that are there today, but it kind of formalized this idea that there would be these different countries with relatively clear boundaries. And these different countries would figure out ways in which to meet with each other and so on without falling into conflict again. They're trying to reduce the likelihood of major conflict. So it's kind of like the conferences like the Bretton Woods Conference and other ones after the Second World War, where you have, just there's all this bloodshed, and a number of the major powers then, coming together and trying to figure out how to develop some more sustainable long-term peace. It's also about the time that Thomas Hobbes is writing, saying, there's all this conflict and brutality and, militias fighting each other. You need a strong government that's going to prevent the conflict like that from breaking out. Remember, he's not alone in saying that. In Asia, in China in particular, you have Lord Cheng writing before Hobbes saying, basically the same thing, that a state needs a strong army, and needs to develop a system of order, and that's basically the most important thing for people. If you don't want them to rebel and be unhappy and so on, you need to give them some sort of structure to live within. Again, we talked about him a little bit earlier. Now then, going into sociology and some of the sociologists who have talked about this, we talked about Max Weber. He surveyed lots of these different systems, societies, and so on, comes up with this definition of the government or the state, this organization that has a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence within the territory. You're going to know that definition by the end of the class if you don't already. And then remember, kind of carrying on Weber's argument was Charles Tilly saying, war essentially makes states and states make war. You have groups that come together to fight off some common enemy, and that helps build them together in a more powerful government or alliance system and so on. And then over time they may decide they want to take over somewhere, conquer somewhere else, or fend off some new invasion. So getting into political theology. So political theology, again, looks at kind of the similarities between religious thought and religious structures and institutions and so on, and how that then is translated into political philosophy and political action and political institutions. So one of the most important things to know about political theology, first of all, is that, or at least in my understanding, is that it tends to be fairly apocalyptic, because most of it is coming out of the Judeo-Christian background, the Abrahamic faiths, that generally, end with an apocalypse, or at least with Christianity, you have that sort of ending. And so anyway, there's this sort of current of apocalypse that we'll kind of identify and discuss in political theology. So political theology then is also associated with some thinkers that were generally opposed to the French Revolution, generally opposed to democracy and the masses, the power of the masses. One of the most kind of eloquent of these thinkers was Joseph de Maistre. He was from Savoy. I forget exactly what his title was. He was fairly low nobility, but he had, one of his jobs was doing something with the executioner. I think he had to read off the charges before the executioner did the execution. So he had, as part of his job, he saw a lot of executions, and some people have pointed out how this probably influenced him and influenced his writing and his perspective and so on. It says, man in general, if reduced to be himself, is too wicked to be free. He saw the French Revolution, and again, the monarchy is overthrown, the aristocracy is overthrown, and a lot of them are executed, and then a lot of the other rebels are executed, as often happens in revolutions. Some people aren't revolutionary enough, or there's infighting, and so he just saw it as this sort of bloody affair. And he was sent to St. Petersburg in Russia to be an ambassador there, and he did a lot of writing from there that kind of was, went made his way down through the ages and so on. But he's an important figure in this idea of the counter-enlightenment. So here is one of the more controversial figure, kind of builds on de Maistre and Thomas Hobbes in a lot of ways. Carl Schmitt, he was a jurist in Germany in the 20th century, widely acknowledged to be an extremely influential legal scholar. He is very controversial. There's a lot of heated writings and discussions about him. One of his arguments is made in this famous book of his called The Concept of the Political, where he says that at the heart of most politics, and really all politics, is this friend-enemy relationship. And really that's really at the heart of political theology as well. And he was kind of applying sort of his understanding, I guess, of Catholicism onto his kind of sociological outlook. So one of the things that he was very interested in, and this kind of pertains to what we're talking about, is he's interested in the idea of the sovereign. Where is power really held? What organization, who are the people who can suspend democracy or, rights or whatever and take some sort of radical action to, enhance national security, or you could say, protect people from some natural disaster or something like this, where, you force people to leave their homes so, they don't catch on fire or something like this, where you basically, eliminate individual rights and people's ability to do anything in response in order for some, way to, save the states, save the idea of the country, and so on. So initially, Schmitt in the 1920s, he was always part of what's called the Conservative Revolution in Germany, which some of whom were Nazis, but most of whom weren't, and is distinct from the Nazi movement. So he was kind of part of that in the 1920s. And he comes up with these ideas for governments and people in power to prevent the far right or the far left from taking power. Again, he's kind of watching the rise of the Nazis on the right and the communists on the left. Then as the Nazis take power, he immediately joins the Nazi Party. He writes a few anti-Semitic articles and starts censoring Jewish authors. I think he leaves the Nazi Party at some point. He's never allowed to teach in Germany again. And he continues writing, continues his analysis, and so on. So anyway, Carl Schmitt, he's like I said, he's a controversial figure. Some have argued about whether or not he should be read, how much that he said contributed to his justification of Nazism, or, was it just opportunism, or, does he have things that are valuable to say despite the fact that he was, part of the Nazi Party for a while, that sort of thing. My personal view is, I don't know, I'm just sort of fascinated by these debates and view it kind of interesting from a historical perspective, and you sort of need to understand him to understand some of the other aspects of political theology and some of the things that are happening today. So he writes this book in the 1920s, and he actually coins the term political theology, so he does have a considerable influence, and we are discussing his work right now. So again, he's thinking about the similarities between religious institutions and structures and politics, and the ways in which power is exercised through these similar yet different institutions. So Carl Schmitt then, he joins de Maistre and others in what are called reactionary politics. Oftentimes, reactionaries are basically authoritarian. If that's like the one thing you can say about them that's fairly consistent, is they tend to be authoritarian, but they mix it with a weird sort of libertarianism, but it's kind of a libertarian authoritarianism or something. Anyway, they tend to be followers of the thinker Thomas Carlyle, who was a Scottish philosopher who worried about modernity and people turning away from nature and this sort of thing, but he also was in favor of slavery and some other things like that, and it's for those reasons that he's generally not really read as much today, even though he did have some interesting things to say about some things, and then other things he was completely off on. So the reactionaries today, then, they kind of build off of people like Machiavelli, Hobbes, Carl Schmitt, de Maistre, Thomas Carlyle here, and others, and they tend to be today. They tend to be kind of concentrated within the tech industry, and if if there's any sort of ideology of which they're kind of associated with, it's kind of this notion of accelerationism. It's this idea that capitalism and technological change should just be accelerated, because basically what will happen then is that it will lead to a breakdown, a collapse of the system. There will be a revolt, whatever, and then you'll get some new system that will emerge. So accelerationism, it has kind of a long history. I think right now it's more associated with, if you were to Google it, you'd probably see a lot of stuff about white supremacy, and that's one aspect of accelerationism. It tends to be popular within white supremacist nationalist circles, as some of these neo-reactionaries are. But they also tend to be futurists. So they're not conservative traditionalists who look back to some, nostalgic past, like Make America Great Again or something like that, although some of them are accelerationists. But for the most part, they are look towards the future, and like I said, many of them are, concentrated in tech culture, and so they're reading a lot of science fiction, watching a lot of science fiction movies, and writing code, and so on and so forth, and then thinking about the future and developing new sort of social systems beyond democracies and the governments we have today. One of the most important of these thinkers, of these neo-reactionaries that is discussed by Timothy Luke in the whatever the article's name is that you're reading. Anyway, he discusses Nick Land. So Nick Land was this cultural theorist in Britain in the 1990s. He's part of something, I forget what it's called, the cybernetic unit cultural analysis, something like that. And basically they were looking at the role of this emerging internet and how it was shaping society. And he became, along with some others, became kind of depressed and kind of nihilistic, basically thinking, it's just chaos. There's no sense of order anymore. Basically, we just have to accelerate the system. And he kind of had like a personal breakdown and went to Taiwan for a while, and then went to Shanghai, writing like travel guides or something. But developing this idea called the Dark Enlightenment. So that's, where that term comes from, or that concept. So the Enlightenment, the first one being, modern science, human rights, liberalism, individual rights, that sort of thing. The Dark Enlightenment then saying some individual rights, definitely a lot of science, and the Dark Enlightenment tends toward authoritarianism. So in a lot of ways, it's more the counter-enlightenment of Joseph de Maistre, with a little bit of Thomas Hobbes and Machiavelli in there, and then applied to the digital online world of today. It's also, and I should say, if you're interested, there's a good podcast called Hermetics. It's also on YouTube, Spotify, that has interviews with some of these kind of esoteric thinkers, like Nick Land. He talks about accelerationism and things like that. Anyway, so there are others who kind of recognize, or I should say, they say that accelerationism isn't just a philosophy, rather it's a process. It's something that's already happening. That, capitalism by its very nature just commodifies everything and pushes everything towards more and more and more, faster, quicker, and so on. And because of that, you have art forms, protest movements, slogans, things like that, natural resources, all of these things are just kind of consumed and subsumed within capitalism and then sold back to us as products. Che Guevara, the revolutionary, was sold back to us as revolutionary on a T-shirt, as a T-shirt, made by some private company in the United States, and maybe the shirt is, comes from the garment industry in Bangladesh or whatever it might be. Anyway, so there's this idea that capitalism is basically just kind of subsuming everything, and accelerationism is just the recognition that that is what is happening. And some people say that, Karl Marx was the first accelerationist because he said, capitalism basically will lead to its own collapse because of the contradictions within the system. Other key thinkers in this area, Gilles Deleuze and Guattari. These two thinkers, they have been writing about this for quite some time, whether using that language or not, but have been, pointing out the ways that capitalism just kind of takes over culture and, kind of takes over our idea of what future possibilities there are, and allows us to kind of imagine these different future worlds that could be, and the reality is that none of them are going to arrive for all of us. Maybe kind of for some of us, but not others. So they point out that they analyze acceleration in a somewhat neutral way. They're not necessarily in favor of it, nor are they completely opposed to it. They just kind of try to recognize it, like I said, as sort of a process. The other major thinker and writer that Timothy Luke talks about in the readings for this week in the Dark Enlightenment and the Anthropocene is this guy, Mencius Moldbug. His real name is Curtis Yarvin. He was a prolific writer. He had a blog that went on for a number of years, kind of attacking progressivism, ideas of egalitarianism, political correctness, multiculturalism, all those sorts of things, and kind of coming at it from a mechanistic engineering computer science background. He was a libertarian at first, had believed that markets should be left unfettered. The private companies are the next step in human evolution, and so on. But then he moved away from that and has argued that you need stability, libertarianism needs stability and order in order for markets to function and so on. And so you need some authoritarianism for that. So he's been arguing for authoritarianism for a while. And he says that, when the thing that's standing in the way is what he calls the cathedral, and that's basically the universities, people like, I suppose, myself, except that I talk about people like him. But anyway, Hollywood, the arts, the political classes, coastal elites, liberals, and so on. And he basically talks about how they have this similar worldview, and basically, this thing needs to collapse, and, he'll have this nihilistic take on the future, and this will, kind of lead us forward, as we'll discuss. Now, the other thing he wrote, as I said, for a while, is Mencius Moldbug. Now, it's kind of interesting about this, about I would say, the people who kind of follow Moldbug and others. A lot of them are kind of influenced by like Dungeons and Dragons and kind of, what you call like nerd culture or something. So here you have Mencius Moldbug as like a dragon, ancient neo-cameralist, red dragon, a reactionary, is not a Republican, Democrat, or even a libertarian. Blah, 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 not a monarchist, is something older and stranger and more powerful. And he talks about how he likes Carlyle, and so on and so forth. So, anyway, it's what I think is interesting is you have this gravitation of people who are very interested in the world of gaming and feudalism, like knights in medieval times, but in the context of, these digital online games and so on, and how they're increasingly, you find that sort of language and so on, making its way into their political philosophies and so on. And so what we're seeing is this creation of a new new feudalism, as we've discussed, and as Timothy Luke talks about in the readings for this week, the growth and power of the tech industry and oligarchy and so on, as they become more and more like monarchies or empires, or probably the most accurate term would be an aristocracy, is what we're seeing develop in the United States. The development of a feudal system. The U.S. hasn't really had one. Maybe you could say kind of the one in the Deep South was the closest thing to a feudal system, but not really so. But maybe we're moving in that direction. And what's interesting too is a lot of these writers, a lot of them are white men. They also tend to, like I said, read a lot of the classics as well. So looking at, there's a lot of Stoic philosophy, this idea that you're a calm person, that, you're able to be virtuous and not be, easily affected by things around you. You're self-sufficient and so on and so forth. So we've seen this explosion of interest in Stoicism amongst a lot of white men who are looking for, some sort of philosophy that speaks to them. Now, a lot of them are misusing and misunderstanding, some of this stuff, as Donna Zuckerberg writes in her book, Not All Dead White Men, Classics and Misogyny in the Digital Age. Interesting thing about her brother Mark runs a little company called Facebook. Anyway, so we see this kind of convergence of an interest in, feudalism, medieval stuff, ancient Rome, Stoicism, as well as a lot of sci-fi. I mean, that's the other thing too, and I love sci-fi, but I don't use it in quite the same way. You see, like, an interest in neuromancer. This is a book by William Gibson, a writer. He came up with the term cyberpunk and cyberspace. He came up with that. It was never really made into a movie, but the closest thing, The Matrix, is kind of like that. You also had, Dune, the classic, one of the first major sci-fi works, which was really, in a lot of ways, focused on this kind of, aristocracy out in space. You'll all know this once you see the new movie when it comes out. But anyway, it's been sort of influential for a lot of these neo-reactionaries, because it's about these aristocrats and who they kind of think that they identify with. Kind of a classic movie that discusses some of this and kind of opens a window onto some of this thinking is this old movie from like 1991 called Sneakers, and it was kind of made during the advent of the internet, and you have people like Ben Kingsley and Robert Redford talking. There are these sort of hacker types and so on, as internet hacking was at that time, but also it's at the end of the Cold War and the emergence of this new world, and he's trying to explain to the other one that it's all driven by information now. All power is wrapped up with this idea of information and ones and zeros, and it's kind of interesting for just kind of the time period it came out too. So my plug for that movie. Okay, why am I jumping to Deng Xiaoping? I mentioned him, I think, in the last lecture, talking about the development of China. Deng Xiaoping he's liked by Mencius Moldbug, the neo-reactionary alt-right writer who I mentioned earlier, and Nick Land. He kind of led China away from a completely state-driven economy that you saw during the Maoist time period to one where there was some private enterprise with, some state, or a lot of state backing. And, that sort of leadership impresses people like Moldbug and Land, who want a strong authoritarian government, and don't like the idea of democracy, but don't like the brutal communism of Maoism or Stalinism. So they looked to Deng Xiaoping, and they also looked to Lee Kuan Yew, who was the Prime Minister of Singapore, and Singapore is, a successful modern nation state. Sorry, not nation state, city state. So Lee Kuan Yew ran Singapore for essentially 3 decades, and he, ran it with an iron fist, allowed certain liberties, but, also, as it says here, promoted the nanny state that hectored people about spitting on the street or failing to flush public toilets. If you were, caught vandalizing or doing drugs, there was, very harsh punishments. And so on. So he managed to bring peace to the area and create prosperity, but to at the expense of certain freedoms. And again, that's the sort of leadership that Moldbug and Land actually want to see. So again, what I would say about accelerationism is that it's a good example of what we call a millenarian movement, which I'll explain in more detail in 1 second. So capitalism is supposed to accelerate, causing the collapse of liberal democracy, and the idea then is that the new system that emerges will just be better. That's like any of these, kind of fantastical political visions of the future, like communism or Nazism or something like this, where there's some cataclysm, some great revolution or war that happens, and then after that everything changes, and you have a new society, and you have utopia, and so on and so forth. So accelerationism, in my view, is just another one of these sorts of apocalyptic thinking, and it's apocalyptic in the sense of kind of theology. Like it's kind of like a religious way of thinking, kind of like the Christian apocalypse. I'll say a lot more about that in a moment. If you're interested in some of this stuff, The Narrow Corridor, States, Societies, and the Fate of Liberty by Acemoglu and Robinson is very good. They point out that things are always kind of accelerating, kind of like the Red Queen in the Alice in Wonderland. The Red Queen has to run faster and faster in order to keep still where she is. That is exactly what you are all doing. And so basically they're saying that a lot of governments have to be kind of like that. They have to find a way to balance the power of the state with the power of society, of individuals, civic groups, that sort of thing. And so you want to have sort of a shackled Leviathan being sort of the government structure, like the US or the UK. Otherwise, it might become more despotic, like China, where there's less freedoms, or it could become absent, so there's no government, like certain tribes where there's not a lot of control over the structure. One counter to the neo-reactionaries, probably hasn't been a lot written about about these guys, and they're mostly guys. Elizabeth Standifer wrote this book, Neo-Reaction, a basilisk, essays on and around the alt-right. So the basilisk is basically this kind of creature who's able to, turn people to stone or something like that. Maybe I'm getting that wrong, but anyway, it's some sort of like monster or something, and they explain the connection in the book. I can't remember what it is, but it's one of the few books that kind of takes apart some of their writings in a very sort of satirical way. It's kind of, you should probably read Moldbug and Land before reading their critiques. But anyway. So as I said, I see neo-reaction and accelerationism as being like a new form of millenarianism. Millenarianism is this belief by religious, political, or social groups that some fundamental transformation of society is going to happen, and then all things will be changed. And Norman Cohn has done a lot of research on this. Looking at this, he has this fantastic book called The Pursuit of the Millennium, Revolutionary Millenarians and Mystical Anarchists of the Middle Ages, looking at sort of these times during the Middle Ages when they thought the apocalypse was coming, and they kind of created this, in Münster, Germany, for example, they created this like utopia commune sort of society, waiting for the apocalypse that didn't quite end up coming, and then it sort of fell apart. He wrote another one, The Cosmos, Chaos, and the World to Come, The Ancient Roots of Apocalyptic Faith, again pointing out that a lot of religions, especially the ones coming out of the Middle East, have kind of an apocalypse. And Christianity in particular, it ends with the book of Revelations and Jesus coming back to judge the living and the dead after this great battle, and so on and so forth. So again, this idea that, there's this great battle, or there's this great tremendous thing that's going to happen and, rupture society, and it will forever be changed. Well, John Gray, a political philosopher, has written about this. He wrote a book called Black Mass, Apocalyptic Religion and the Death of Utopia, which I highly recommend if you're kind of interested in this stuff, where he kind of expands this idea of millenarianism outside of just, religious fundamentalism, and looks at how it applies to political ideologies like the Soviet Union, like Nazism, and then he looks at religion like modern-day Islamic jihadism, or Christian fundamentalism, or certain ideas pushed by imperialists and that sort of thing. QAnon and accelerationism are both, again, perfect examples of millenarian movements, which I'll explain. In Black Mass, Gray talks about one chapter called The Americanization of the Apocalypse, where he talks about the American neoconservatives. You probably don't know who many of these guys are. They were in the Bush II administration when they kind of planned the invasion of Iraq. They were part of a group called the Project for the New American Century, which is this century. The idea being that, they were going to show off America's military might in the Middle East, spread democracy, and, this would, lead other countries to back off and so on. It failed miserably in many ways in Iraq. Their project largely seen as a failure. No one's really talking about invading countries and, trying to spread democracy anymore. But again, it was this millenarian thinking that, they'll just invade a country, topple a dictator and, tell them about a constitution and, you just kind of expect things to work out, because that's how it's supposed to be. Today, the best example, I think, as I said, accelerationism, also QAnon. I think QAnon in some ways is even better. It's closer to millenarianism than a lot of things are. So QAnon, of course, this idea that, there's, who knows, various conspiracies, Hollywood people in, powerful Democrats and so on who are part of some child pedophile ring and so on and so forth. And you see it's popular amongst a lot of Republicans, amongst, some adults. And that's kind of interesting because, again, millenarian movements, they tend to be, once people fall into them and believing in them, it's hard for them to break free because, their whole way of thinking then becomes sort of focused on this idea of this event that's going to happen. And once it happens, the world will change. And for, QAnon and some accelerationists, that event was on January 6th in Washington, D.C., where you had, this invasion of the Capitol building, kind of a oh, excuse me. Fairly brutal attack and occupation of government properties. Again, QAnon, the storm, getting ready for it and stuff. Just fits perfectly in with some of the psychology, this other way of thinking. I mean, when it happened, it was happened very quickly, and I don't think a lot of us realized the fighting that was happening outside and the police that were being drugged down, beaten, and in some cases killed. But primarily saw scenes of people walking through in government buildings and so on. And then seeing, the gallows that were set up. Excuse me. So again, what was supposed to happen was some sort of revolution, uprising where they're going to take over the Capitol building and, all the evil Democrats and whoever would be arrested and Trump would go on being president and so on and so forth. And of course, none of this then happened. So not everyone there was a accelerationist or a QAnon believer. Some of them were just caught up in the moment, and that brings us to a very important aspect of political sociology, and that's kind of the social psychology behind it. So Gustave Le Bon, one of the first people to study this in detail, says the masses have never really thirsted after truth. Whoever can supply them with illusions is easily their master. Whoever attempts to destroy their illusions is always their victim. So he was not optimistic about people. What we see is that groups tend to, if they're trying to regiment people into doing something in a group, you want to have de-individuation. And that's how the Nazis and totalitarian movements succeed, is because you reduce the sense of individual identity and diminish self-regulation. And so people basically, does what the rest of the group does. This has been studied in a number of ways. I think one of the most interesting is a study of suicide baiting. So these are when crowds of people actually encourage someone to commit suicide. They're threatening to commit suicide, and then they, suicide bait them. They say, yeah, come on, try and do it. So this one says, I'm going to kill myself. This other person says, please do, nobody would miss you. Online. Here, one interesting study found that people were more likely to do it when there was a larger crowd. And they were more likely to do it after 6 p.m. when it's night out. So in both cases, people are more anonymous. And when people are more anonymous, then they're more likely to engage in kind of awful behavior, whether that's violence or, kind of encouraging someone to harm themselves. Now, we have to understand, as we talk about violence, that all violent people psychopathic? Most violent criminals are not. And most violent people are actually believe that they're morally justified in their acts. And so this brings us to, again, back to violence and trying to understand it from the perspective of political sociology. We have to go back a ways to Sun Tzu, who was writing during the Warring States, or I believe during the Warring States period in China. And, I think one of his best pieces of advice when it comes to wars is the best way to win a war is to not fight one. And so he kind of advocates for, using different methods like deception and things like that if you have to prevent war. But, if you have to go to war, then there's a certain art to it. And military and political tacticians and business industry leaders and so on have been reading the art of war and learning from it for centuries. One of the things that we also see in this world of neo-reaction is changing power. So Moldbug and Land, they Lee Kuan Yew and Deng Xiaoping, these powerful Asian authoritarian leaders. Then others, though, kind of have to focus on the idea of there being hegemonic powers, who has the dominant power, that sort of thing. And Paul Kennedy, the scholar, wrote a book looking at the rise and fall of these great hegemonic powers, finding that over time, kind of like with Rome, military expenditure overstretches the government, and then, at a certain point, they can't really meet their basic needs. Kennedy puts economics at the core of the analysis, which is, for the most part, I would say fairly important, but it's not the only thing. So morality plays a big role too. And so we have to look at moral systems like Montesquieu. Montesquieu was a writer. He wrote a lot of political philosophies that were then adopted by the founders of the United States. You also had in China a tribute system bound regional powers such as Korea, Vietnam into a stable sort of Chinese-centric world. And, there you have similar systems such as Buddhism and Confucianism and things like that. But there's also the concern about what Thucydides worried about. He was a Greek historian who looked at some of the conflicts between different countries and saw that Sparta, which was one of the islands around Greece, and Athens had been through a few wars, and I think it was while Sparta was rising, Athens was also a very powerful country, and they had to fight each other. One of them had to go, basically. And so since then, historians have called this the Thucydides trap. Basically, when one major power, one hegemon falls, you get the rise of the other. So as Germany was rising in the late 1800s and early 1900s, you're starting to see already the sort of overstretching and kind of collapse of the British or decline of the British Empire. So today, of course, when people talk about the Thucydides trap, we're mainly talking about China and the United States. But the good thing is that a lot of people are aware of this and want to prevent it. Even Xi Jinping of China says we all need to work together to avoid the Thucydides trap, destructive tensions between an emerging power and established powers. So, there are, of course, nationalists in the U.S. and China who want to fight and want conflict, but a lot of the more sober-minded leaders and so on would prefer not to have a violent conflict. At the same time, we know that the state is an organization that basically it gets its legitimacy because it holds a monopoly on violence within a territory. So under what conditions then is this just, that we have a police force or a military that goes to conflict, goes to war or something like this? Well, some of this comes out of early political theology. Thomas Aquinas, way back when, said that basically, war is just if the goal is peace. If you're trying to fend off some invaders because you want, you just want them to stop invading, and then there will be peace. You have a just cause because the other guys, the other army is, they're all bad and whatnot. If you have a true declaration of war so that it's well understood what's going on, that you're not just, surprising people with it. And also that there's not dishonesty, that there's openness and candor, which, again, not exactly what we see in wars. So maybe a lot of the wars we see aren't so just. Others have built on different aspects of what a just war is, and this is generally what you tend to see. Must be for a just cause, must be declared lawful by an authority. There must be intention behind the war. It must be good. There must be, a good chance of success, and so on and so forth. I'm going to go kind of quickly so I can wrap up fairly soon. Lenin and some of the early communists, basically in the 20th century, they believed that, the only just war was the revolution against communism, that basically that's the only conflict that matters, the lower class, the working class fighting the ruling class, and that basically everything else is unjust, and this is the only morally just way in which conflict should happen. Of course, we know that revolutions and wars, and it doesn't really seem to matter what the social system is. There's different types of conflict and wars that we see break out. Some of the changes that have occurred, though, have happened in terms of the way people look. So uniforms, certain channels of communication, the treatment of prisoners, all of these things were developed over time, often between European powers as they fought each other, ways in which to have some sort of idea, some sort of common moral understanding of war, of what was allowed, what was not, and so on. So that's why you would, if you sometimes wonder why these, groups of soldiers used to just kind of like march up in lines to each other and fire, not, try and sneak through the bushes or something in more camouflage. It was part of this, this rule making regarding how wars would be fought. It was more kind of chivalrous and that sort of thing. In the Napoleonic War, though, people were just trying to win, and it was getting pretty desperate, and those wars were particularly bloody. I mean, you were getting the use of more gunpowder than you were seeing in previous wars. And so you started to see the rise of guerrilla conflict and guerrilla fighters. And so guerrilla fighters has been, guerrilla war has been kind of a key part of a lot of conflict in recent years. And there's been, a number of good books about this. Guerrilla Warfare by Che Guevara, the Latin American revolutionary Mao Zedong's various writings on guerrilla warfare, The Theory of the Partisan by Carl Schmitt. All of them are focused on this idea of irregular forces, meaning, you're not well supplied, you don't necessarily have the best equipment or uniforms or stuff like this, but you still might be able to win despite that. And good examples would be the Viet Cong in Vietnam defeating the United States, that sort of thing. Other things we have to think about when we talk about political sociology and these sort of militant movements. Daniel Shiro, a sociologist, has done a lot of work in this area and has looked at militant movements around the world that have come to power and have failed to bring about what they promised. Again, a lot of millenarian movements that they meant good things. They're trying to provide for everybody, but then it just devolves into an authoritarian nightmare. This doesn't mean that you should give up on the idea of freedom or idealism or even revolution, but one should learn from history and perhaps know what sort of limitations there might be. As Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. I like that quote. Shiro looked at modern tyrants and finds that we see tyranny tend to rise when you have strong feelings of nationalism, as we discussed earlier, plus a deep resentment against what's perceived as foreign influences in a state that doesn't perhaps have a powerful structure. Also, then when you get ideas of scientific certainty that are used to justify, differences between people, say like, IQ differences or income differences or things like this. And then these are used to socially engineer a nation. Then we see again the likelihood of tyranny. And he looks at a whole range of different tyrants. Tyrants often survive, though, because they reward those who haven't had power before to crush those beneath them. The tyrant grinds down his slaves, and they don't turn against him. They crush those beneath him. Emily Bronte, I love that. Love that quote. So, where does that leave us right now? It's hard to say. Political theology, I think it's promising. I do think that Carl Schmitt was onto something by seeing the scaffolding that religious institution and organization provided for politics, for political institutions. Miguel Vater has kind of expanded beyond Carl Schmitt, and so we can return to thinking about political theology, but in new and different ways. Jonathan Haidt writes about the similarities between politics and religion and social psychology. Because we are heading into interesting, chaotic times where guerrilla warfare is picking up, where we're seeing the rise in militia formation, and it's unclear. It's unclear where all of this is going. But what we often find is that groups tend to feel that once they are well armed, and then once they unleash their attack, that there are that they're likely, once they think they're likely to win, and then that they're likely to implement the change that needs to happen, and from their society will be transformed. All right, so that is it for political theology. You can think about that all weekend long. All right, everyone, have a good weekend.